Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Islamic Library Chennai.
Jesus. It's a name everyone knows, and while he's obviously central to Christianity, he's also an incredibly important prophet in Islam. But how does the Quran, Islam's holy book, actually see him? Today we're going to dive into the story of Eesa, that's the Quran's Jesus, and, the perspective might be a little different than what you're expecting.
Right from the start, this verse from the Quran really sets the stage for the whole discussion. It draws this really powerful parallel. Jesus' creation is just like Adam's. And if you think about that for a second, Adam had no father or mother, and Jesus had no father. The message here is that these miraculous births are really signs of God's absolute power. It's a theme that's going to be central to everything we unpack today.
So here's our game plan. First, we'll look at the Quran's general view of Jesus. Then we're going to tackle the big questions. Was he human or divine? What about the title Son of God and the Trinity? We'll even see how the Bible itself is used to make this case before we wrap it all up with what Islam sees as the one consistent message. All right, let's jump in with the Quran's fundamental view of Jesus. Because before we get into any of the differences, it is absolutely crucial to understand this. In Islam, Jesus is not some minor character. He is one of the most revered, most respected prophets of God, period. So, building on that opening comparison to Adam, the Islamic perspective doesn't diminish Jesus at all. Instead, it just reframes him. His miraculous birth isn't seen as proof that he's divine. No, it's presented as the ultimate sign of God's power, the ability to create something with just a simple command, just like he did with Adam. And this whole idea of reframing leads us straight into the core theological question, the one that really separates the Islamic and Christian views. Was Jesus a human prophet, or was he divine? The Quran doesn't shy away from this question at all. It addresses it head-on, and it presents a really clear, logical case for Jesus' complete and total humanity. The argument that's presented here is actually fascinating because it's so simple. To prove their humanity, the Quran points to something universal, something we all do, eating. It makes a specific point to say that both Jesus and his mother Mary ate food. And the logic is pretty straightforward, right? A divine being, by definition, shouldn't have any physical needs. The need for food, for sustenance, well, that's a fundamental trait of created, mortal beings. So, from this perspective, the fact that they needed to eat is presented as clear-cut proof of their humanity. Okay, so this focus on humanity leads directly to the next major point of difference, that title, Son of God. In Islam, prophets are held in the highest regard as messengers. But the concept of God literally having a son is explicitly rejected. And the Quran's rejection of this idea is incredibly strong and direct. This verse frames the title Son of God not as some divine truth, but as a statement that came from people, from their mouths, rather than from God himself.
And this verse, this one really gets to the theological why behind it all. The Quran contrasts the physical, biological act of having a son with the unique divine power to create something from nothing with a single command, be. So, from this point of view, saying God takes a son is like giving a human-like quality to the divine. And that's a concept that Islam just fundamentally rejects.
So if we follow the logic from humanity and sonship, we naturally arrive at the Christian doctrine of the Trinity.
Okay, so let's just make sure we're on the same page. The Trinity is that foundational Christian belief that God is one being who exists as three distinct, co-equal persons, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. As we're about to see, the Quran argues directly against this, strongly favoring God's absolute and indivisible oneness. And once again, the language in the Quran is completely unambiguous. This verse is a direct refutation of any idea that God could possibly be the third of three. It hammers home that core message of pure monotheism. There is only one God, and he is indivisible. This verse really brings it all together, doesn't it? It directly tells people, do not say three, and it explicitly connects the rejection of the Trinity to the rejection of divine sonship. This highlights what is truly the absolute cornerstone of Islam, the principle of Tawheed, the pure, uncompromising oneness of God. Okay, now this is where things get really interesting. To support the Quran's portrayal of Jesus, the argument actually turns to the Bible itself. It quotes words attributed directly to Jesus to argue that his own statements line up perfectly with the Islamic view of him. So, the first example is from the Gospel of Mark.
This exchange is interpreted as Jesus himself pushing back against the title of absolute goodness, pointing out that, hey, that kind of quality, that belongs to God and God alone.
Next up, from the Gospel of John, we have this very famous statement. From the Islamic perspective, this is read as a crystal-clear declaration by Jesus that he is not co-equal with God, which of course challenges a core belief of the Trinity. And here's a third example, also from John's Gospel. In this one, Jesus explicitly calls himself a man who is just relaying a message he heard from God. I mean, that description fits the Islamic definition of a prophet, a human messenger, to a T.
So if we pull all these passages from the Bible together, the argument being made is this, that Jesus' own words paint a picture of him as a man who is beneath God, who has no independent power of his own, and who actually worshipped God, even calling him my God and your God.
And all of this, it all brings us to the final unifying point. The argument takes everything we've talked about and pulls it together into one consistent theme, the single core mission that was shared by Jesus and every other prophet in Islam.
This is such a powerful verse. It shows Jesus speaking to God on the Day of Judgment, and in it, he confirms that his message was simple, direct, and exactly what God told him to say, to call all people to worship the one true God, who is both his Lord and their Lord.
And that really brings us to the ultimate conclusion here. The Quran presents this message of pure monotheism, of submitting to the one God, not as some new religion, but as the single, timeless faith of all the prophets, from Adam to Jesus, all the way to Muhammad. In fact, the word Islam itself literally means submission to God.
So we end on this thought. The figure of Jesus, when viewed through the lens of the Quran, isn't the divine Son of God. He is a beloved, mighty, but ultimately human prophet who called people back to worshiping the one God. And it leaves us with a much broader question to think about. How can one single historical figure be the foundation for such vastly different, yet equally deeply held, understandings of who he was?